It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back. I'm Doug Blackmon. In this episode of American Forum, we return to our special series asking, what now, in the wake of all the turmoil around race in America over the past 2 years? What should Americans of goodwill be focused on if we are sincere about finding our way beyond the cliched responses to these crises and forward on issues of race? American Forum is searching for new voices and new dialogue with thinkers, scholars, and other leaders with perhaps less predictable answers to the questions, what now? Where do we go from here? What should Americans, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Tea Party, be talking about? Joining us today is Jamelle Bouie, one of the brightest young journalists in the country and now chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, where he writes about national politics, history, public policy, and racial inequality. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you heard me say just now the idea behind this series of dialogues we're trying to have, which is really a quest for almost the topic of a conversation. You know, I think we all know what we're worried about in terms of race and what we've been upset by over the past 2 years. We've got a lot of agreement about that something is wrong, but we can't seem to have a dialogue that goes anywhere.
The thing that's been remarkable to me, looking not just at places like Ferguson, but Baltimore and sort of the broad picture of race relations in the United States, is the extent to which, and I think this is sort of a paraphrase of a stat, but if your parents are born in a segregated inner city in the 70s, and you probably still live there, that there is remarkable durability to the structure of racial inequality in this country, and we just don't talk about it. And so when things like Ferguson happen, it seems bewildering because we just don't know that that's the case. And there's very little, I think, national will to talk about it, in part because talking about it implies that we're going to try to do something about it.
On the one hand, over the past 50 years, we've actually been extraordinarily successful at defeating individual racism.
Right.
The odds of my son, who's 18 years old, the odds of him going to college and soon and encountering other whites with openly racist ideas and a willingness to express them and a willingness to a desire to think badly of African Americans or do harm to African Americans, there's really very little chance, I think, of him encountering that. And so on the one hand, we've defeated that kind of racism, but on the other hand, I think it's also the case that the majority of white Americans don't particularly give a damn about the fact that such a large percentage of African American children face a lifetime of obstacles radically different than that which faces the majority of white children.
Part of the problem is that Americans have sort of this national schema for how these things are supposed to work, right? That you come to the country, however way you came to the country, and things are hard at first, and then you work hard and things get better. And there's some room in that schema for the fact of Jim Crow and segregation, but those I think Americans only tend to think of in terms of legal obstacles, in terms of this personal racism. So once people can vote, once people can, for the most part, live where they want to live, don't encounter sort of overt discrimination, then in the kind of national scheme of how this is supposed to work, things are fine and people improve. If they don't improve, it's because they aren't working hard enough. And I think that's where a lot of white Americans are. And it's difficult, genuinely difficult, in part because it's hidden, in part because American life is so segregated, to see that this is not, in fact, how it's ever worked for African Americans. And because sort of that racial disadvantage in sort of economic life and correspondingly in political life reproduces itself over generations because of sort of persistent things that we just don't fix. When you get to 2015 and people are saying, listen, these problems still exist, I think for many white Americans it's bewildering. It's like, well, why, you can vote, you can get jobs, like what's the issue?
And what's your answer to that? If you hear that, or if you hear it in your head when someone is saying something else, but you think that's what they mean?
We never really tried desegregation in a sustained way. we never really tried to rectify the mass imbalances of wealth and opportunity that existed in 1964 and 1968 and kind of just perpetuated themselves. We, in addition to not really trying, we took active steps to disinvest decades later. And after the Great Recession, we've done very little to sort of even try to account for the fact that so much of black wealth and black opportunity was just demolished by the collapse of the housing market. All these things have again persisted and gotten worse and gotten aggrieved. And at the same time, and here's what's tricky, right? At the same time, the president is Barack Obama. In the previous administration, high-level officials were black. American popular culture, to a great extent, is black in a way that it's never really been before. And with all of those things acting in concert from this 30,000-foot view, it does not look like there's this huge inequality when there is. I work hard to sort of kind of say simultaneously that there is real progress in ways that are important and meaningful. It is important and meaningful that the President of the United States is African American. But so much of the problems that we had in 1968 were never actually solved. And that's what we're living with now.
It's also significant that 4 years ago, at this time in the political campaign, there was an African-American candidate who was leading the GOP PAC for a certain period of time, whatever one thought of Herman Cain. And now here we are 4 years later, and there's an African-American candidate who's right at the center of the fray for the GOP again. That complicates the narrative of that, the problem here is that conservatives are still racist and they don't want things to be done for African Americans. Then why are they showing such support consistently for African American candidates? It must not be about race.
I think this gets to the point you made earlier about the fact that we've done a very good job of getting rid of personal racism. And I think when Americans and just people in general think about racism, they very much think about it in these personal terms of racism being a thing of animosity or animus towards someone who looks different than them. But racism is also very much about resources. One way to think about something like Jim Crow is our system for determining who resources could be taken from and given to. And when racism is tied to this resource and economic component, all of a sudden the dynamics change. So right now in Brooklyn, in New York, there is a controversy around school rezoning, that there's this overcrowded school that's predominantly white and Asian American, and just across the block is a school located kind of in the projects that is at half capacity, that because of its poverty has a ton of programs, and the city wants to sort of say, well, we got this half capacity school and this 1.5 times capacity school, we can just kind of, move people over and problem solved. And those Brooklyn parents in the predominantly white school don't want to do it. And to a person, I won't say to a person because I don't know that for certain, but I have a strong suggestion that if you ask someone, it's just not do you just don't want to send your kids to school with black kids? They'd say, no, absolutely not. It's that I don't want to see my kids' test scores go down, or I don't want to see my kids lose resources. And so, because race and racism is tied to resources and who is perceived to have less resources, right? It's not so much that millions of white Americans are just sort of like, I don't want to help black people. It's that black people, I think, in a real way, are associated with just like being at the bottom of a caste. And in every society where there are castes, people don't want to be associated with that bottom caste. And I do not know how one breaks that association, because it is strong and durable kind of across American society.
Schools filled with very poor children,
right,
whatever they look like, also have a different climate to them, typically.
Right.
There are different kinds of discipline issues. There are different levels of what children are bringing to school in terms of their preparation to be there, the way that they behave at school. There are, in fact, material differences, right, between schools that have poor kids in them and schools that have certainly upper income kids in them. And so that gets wrapped into this as well. But one of the problems one has is that when middle class or white families or middle class black families show resistance to the idea of a combination like the one you're describing, it's almost always perceived as being, well, this must be fundamentally rooted in race, when in reality, if one's honest about it, there are other things at play too.
There are other things that I think are tied up into race. That like race isn't just skin color. Race is also sort of perceptions of someone's place in kind of the broad scheme of society. And I'm not going to say it's like understandable that like you know I don't want to send my kids with black kids. I think that's a wrong-headed thing. And I think if you look at the data, right, that if you an upper income parent who sends their kid to a poor school, that kid's going to be fine, right? That's where the data strongly suggests that for rich parents, there's no actual danger in sending your kids to school with poor kids. And for the poor kids, having the resources of the rich kids is tremendously helpful. Right. But, you know, in a society where race is just as much about, where race is class, right? Where race is all of these things that you can't disentangle from, then almost inherently these other legitimate concerns, like I don't know how we're going to deal with behavior issues, become tied up in race. And there's sort of no way to disentangle them. You also muddle things if you purely say, well, this is just because people are racist.
Yeah, it's a Gordian knot. And so now we've been, over the past 2 years, though, we have had, since Ferguson, even though Ferguson was by no means the first incident
right.
along these lines, but there has been something distinctive about this period of time and the response to Ferguson. It's also fascinating that over the course of this series of incidents, which I'd be curious what you think about this. I think the reality of why this has been a concentrated period of this is simply because of our society reached a certain ubiquity of cell phone, telephone,
yeah.
And camera technology. And so suddenly we began to capture more of these kinds of incidents that in the past what had happened would have been more disputed. But they also have become this fascinating sampling of that over the course of the past year and a half. It turns out that what happened in Ferguson, for instance, was tremendously misunderstood. The original narrative was not correct. I think we can safely say
right.
that the police officer did not gun down this young man with his hands in the air far away from him and kill him in cold blood. But it turned out that false narrative did nonetheless reveal an array of problems with law enforcement with regards to race in that particular place. Then later we get to these other incidents where it was the gunning down of someone
right.
in cold blood, running away, something that a lot of us would have said, well, that really can't happen. Things can get out of control, but they're not going to just shoot somebody down. And then we finally get to the murderous rampage in Charleston. So we have seen a kind of cross-section of everything that seems to be embedded and that has been there for a long time, and that includes a real instinct to misinterpret some things.
Right.
Yeah. But so where does this go? I mean, have we gotten anything out of this conversation yet?
So I think we have, and so far it's not been necessarily concrete or political. It's not kind of manifested itself in policy yet. But I think it's significant, right, that you have millions of Americans, and not just African Americans, who readily affirm a slogan like Black Lives Matter. Right? That's no small thing, and it's no small thing in large part because typically, in the, let's say, Rodney King, right? Things, even with the video, things are so disputed that these experiences seem so foreign and alien that well-meaning white Americans may say, well, I'm not too sure. But this ubiquity of cell phone technology, and it's interesting, just as a kind of parenthetical, that the thing that makes Ferguson distinctive from, say, what happened in Charleston, not in North Charleston with Walter Scott, for example, or what happened in Cincinnati earlier this past summer. With Ferguson, there wasn't actually any video of Michael Brown's shooting, right? That when there wasn't any video, things became very muddled and disputed. But in places where there had been video, it's much less so. But the ubiquitous presence of video has, I think, opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that there is a serious problem with how American police departments decide to police predominantly black areas. That I just do not think people would have believed was the case. I think, everyone would say, well, there's a few bad apples, but the sense that this may be systemized is newly revealed by all of these many cases. And so that, to me, the fact that awareness exists and that awareness exists in this affirmation of Black Lives Matter, which to me is both a prosaic statement about sort of the lives of citizens, but also like a concrete thing of saying that these problems that this group of people identifies are real, is a significant change. I mean, I don't know where that leads policy-wise. It is interesting to me that you even have Republican candidates in August, Marco Rubio, gave this very excellent answer on Black Lives Matter, kind of saying that this is a legitimate problem that we need to tackle. And I don't know what that looks like in terms of policy, in part because police departments are intensely local things. So there really is only so much the federal government can do. But it's a meaningful change. And
it certainly has prompted I think maybe a more general reconsideration of police behavior, and also at some sort of subterranean place, I think, a reconsideration of a bargain that had been in place for a very long time, in which our society essentially said to law enforcement that we trust you to use too much force when you must. We trust you that sometimes you actually may arrest someone for this minor offense, but in reality, you know there's a bigger problem with this particular person in this community, and we kind of trust that those variables will work themselves out, and that ultimately the system will still be just. And I think seeing with our own eyes the way the system has come to work has triggered a reconsideration of some of that.
It also helps that crime has gone down, right? If this were the middle of the 1980s, I'm not sure you would have this much reconsideration. But you have this perfect storm of there's just less crime in American society. We can see with our own eyes bad policing and to some extent systems of bad policing. And then you have a protest movement that's trying to make it as visible as possible and is forcing at least a rhetorical response from national political figures. And the combination of all of that, I think, makes a lot of people reconsider their prior views. And I mean, for me, as someone who does think that democratic action can work, it's very heartening to see minds being changed by this confluence of factors. There was a poll, I forget who did it, but there was a poll last summer or last fall, and they asked, do you think the American criminal justice system is fair? And do you think it's fair to African Americans? Before Ferguson, it was like a pretty even racial divide. But after Ferguson, that racial divide really, it didn't go away, but it minimized significantly. And that to me is a sign of progress.
It's also notable, I think, and important to remember, that and relates to the declining crime rates, that at the time that these draconian law enforcement measures were being put in place and these incredibly long sentences for relatively minor drug offenses, that African Americans, by and large, supported those measures as well, because the crime wave of the 80s and the early 90s was perceived by them very specifically as an existential threat. I think there's also been some interesting things written in recent times about a similar phenomenon back in the 70s when the Rockefeller drug laws were being put in place, and the degree to which that African American leaders in New York actually were very supportive of some of those measures. But then it is finally when the crime rates recede that we wake up and look around, and in certain communities
kind of in this stupor, what did we do?
Exactly, what did we do? Where did all the young black men go from this neighborhood? So it is important, I think, in an honest dialogue, that we be able to be honest about that. We all got on this boat together in some respects, and now together we have to sort it out. Let's go back to the turmoil of the past 2 years. But so far, the climax of it all was the terrible murder in Charleston, and then the debate there took another turn, I think, both in that it was impossible for almost anyone to, obviously no one could deny what had happened, no one could deny that there was a new dimension of horror to all of this, the obvious innocence of the victims, no dispute about that. So that changed things. But then it was interesting to me how quickly it then resurrected the flag debate and the Confederate symbols debate, which had not really been part of this discussion until that moment. And suddenly you had this astonishing sequence of events where the Confederate flag comes off the state capitol grounds in South Carolina, something that would have been viewed as politically impossible just a few months before. But was that actually a good accomplishment, or did it give a sense of satisfaction that something important had been done, but maybe nothing very important had been done?
I think probably both. Taking down the Confederate flag was, in its own small way, kind of at least a public repudiation of some of that, as if to say, and in her speech announcing that the flag was coming down or that she would pursue it, Nikki Haley did say, the governor of South Carolina did say, the flag means some things to some people and some things to other people, and been twisted by hate. And I think that is wrong-headed. I think the flag has a very kind of unambiguous meaning. So But still, good thing that it came down. I don't discount symbols because they're important, and there's a reason why, in the first place, people fought to get that flag up there. On the same token, one of the people who was killed in the shooting, Clementa Pinckney, I hope I got that name correct.
I think you did.
Was pushing for body cameras on police. He was pushing for police reform efforts in the South Carolina State House. I don't think those efforts are going to succeed, right? And so I do think that in that regards, it was a cosmetic measure, something to say that we did something, but nothing to fundamentally change sort of the underlying facts of racial inequality and racism, both in South Carolina and sort of wherever this has happened. In North Charleston, where Walter Scott was killed, police stopped thousands of people for no particular reason, just to sort of like see what they're up to. And the vast majority of those people are black. I would rather, all things equal, I would rather see that end than to see the Confederate flag come down.
As we now near the end of this first black presidency, and probably likely to be the only black presidency for some period of time, though it's possible Ben Carson will be elected president. But the odds are that it'll be a while before there's another black president, I would imagine. But first, what's your view on the relationship between President Obama and African Americans writ large right now?
My sense is that President Obama is an incredibly important symbolic figure to the African American community, such that it exists, the African American community. There are recurring conversations right now about how the Republican Party can win back its previous percentage of African American support. It's 10%, it's 11%. My hunch is that the perceived disrespect towards President Obama over the course of his administration by Republicans completely precludes that. That the symbolic ties are so strong that Black Americans basically feel, if you couldn't respect sort of among the best people in our community, then why should we give you our support ever? Even if there are places where we agree with you completely.
And so whoever the next president is, Democrat or Republican, if you were advising that person, if it was the day after the election and they called you in and
for
said,
some insane reason they called me in.
For some reason they called you in and said, look, on this whole race thing, this whole turmoil over the past 2 years, tell me what to do. Tell me how to engage on this in a meaningful and constructive way that is not just me giving a speech that says, this is really a problem, we need to do something about it, but have no real idea what to do. What's your advice to the new president?
Well, I would advise sort of a two-pronged approach. And the first is to really shore up the I'm trying to look for the word, the political aspect of this in terms of sort of substantive political rights, right? We have an erosion of the Voting Rights Act. It just came down that Alabama closed all of its DMVs in its counties that were 75% African American after passing a voter ID law where you could only pick up an ID at a DMV. I'm not going to read into the hearts and minds of these Alabama legislators, but it sounds suspicious. And so, whoever the president is, Republican or Democrat, I think need to direct their Justice Department and their Civil Rights Division to really aggressively go after states that attempt to deny voting rights through whatever convoluted scheme, continue the Obama administration's approach towards holding banks and mortgage companies accountable for discriminatory loans. The Obama Department of Housing has just kind of begun an initiative to try to reduce housing segregation and better enforce the Fair Housing Act. I think that is something that the next president needs to continue and invest more resources in. So much can only be done through legislation, and that's where it gets tough. But insofar that either a Republican or a Democratic president can get legislation through Congress, I think there are small things that can happen. There should be more and more efforts to sort of reduce the amount of time we're sentencing people to prison, to reduce the number of crimes we have that send people to prison, and to encourage states to do the same. The '94 crime bill, that the bargain was in exchange for toughening your measures, will give you money to build prisons. I think there's the political space and will to essentially do the opposite of that, to say if you lessen your commitment to your carceral state, we will give you money to improve educational outcomes, we'll give you money to improve healthcare, and to really try to make up for the damage done by mass incarceration. And broadly, sort of, there's the politics side and the economic side, and I really think the economic side, for the next president is looking for any mechanism possible, either the legislation or the bureaucracy, to begin to peel away and mitigate the long-term impacts of mass incarceration, which are, their family dissolution, their economic disadvantagement, their entire neighborhoods kind of hollowed out of employable young men. In that, I think the federal government has a responsibility to the people that is harmed, not to do something about it.
Well, I hope the new president listens to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jamil Bowie, Chief Political Correspondent for Slate Magazine. We invite you to join the conversation with American Forum and our guests on Twitter or Facebook. For transcripts or podcasts of American Forum, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum, where this program is available 24 hours a day. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next week.